The Dark Angels are considered amongst the most powerful and secretive of the Loyalist Space Marine chapters. They were the first legion of the original 20 Space Marine legions to be created during the first founding of the 30th millennium. Though they claim complete allegiance and service to the Emperor of mankind, their actions and secret goals at times seem at odds with that professed loyalty, as the Dark Angels strive above all other things to atone for an ancient crime of betrayal committed over 10,000 standard years ago against the trust of the Emperor during the time of the Horus Heresy. The Dark Angels stand first amongst the Space Marine chapters, as they have done since their very inception as the First Legion. They are a proud chapter with traditions and rituals that date back to the earliest days of the Imperium of Man. The origins of the Dark Angels remain shrouded in mystery. Few imperial records of the chapter's beginnings still exist, nor are there many mentions of the part it played in the Emperor's Great Crusade during the early 31st millennium. Most references in the histories of the Imperium to its deeds during the accursed times of the Horus Heresy have actually been expunged. Yet a legend persists that at one point the Dark Angels teetered on the very brink of heresy, and that an act of the most terrible betrayal dishonored all of the First Legion's feats of valor, leaving an enduring stain upon all of its successor chapters' honor. Such is their shame that from that time onwards, the Dark Angels and their unforgiven successors, of which there are more than 19 currently in Imperial service, strive for absolution from the sins of millennia past. The Dark Angels' terrible secret is this: during the Horus Heresy, some of their brethren were turned to the side of chaos. The renegades were defeated in a battle that destroyed the Dark Angels' Legion homeworld, Caliban, but many of the traitor Dark Angels survived to be cast through space and time by the direct intervention of the Chaos Gods. These survivors are known to those few Dark Angels who are granted the knowledge of their existence as the Fallen Angels or just the Fallen. In the eyes of the chapter's leaders, there is only one way that the chapter can ever atone for its shame, restoring its honor and trust in the eyes of the Emperor. All of the fallen must be found and either made to repent their ancient sin or slain. This story of treachery and betrayal is the Dark Angels' hidden shame, and their secret mission to destroy all of the fallen is now their only hope of salvation. No one knows of this other than the Dark Angels, their successor chapters, and perhaps the Emperor himself, interred within his golden throne. The chapter has been shaped by its dark past and is secretive and monastic in nature, with much time given over to worship and prayer. There are many different levels within the chapter which individuals may gradually rise through. On attaining each new level, they are granted a little more knowledge of the truth behind the Dark Angel's origins, but only the highest-ranking members of the chapter, the members of what is known as the Inner Circle, know the terrible, shameful secret of what occurred 10,000 Terran years ago. The Dark Angels hold more battle honors than almost any other chapter. Its only equals are its own successors. The chapter has fought the length and breadth of the Imperium and beyond, against every foe that has ever beset mankind. Dark Angels have held Orkwags at bay, crushed planetary uprisings, and saved entire star systems from the incursions of the ruinous powers. They have fought across searing deserts, in the cold void of space, in dense carnivorous alien jungles, and in the depths of the wildest underhives. Yet, while chapters such as the Blood Angels and the Ultramarines are lauded wherever they fight, the Dark Angels shun laurels and turn their backs upon adulation. Even though the chapter has stood side by side with every major arm of the Imperium's military, it has always maintained a distance, an aloofness, that sets its brethren further apart from the bulk of humanity, and even from other space marines. When the Dark Angels join a larger force to execute a great war or Imperial crusade, they do so according to their own unfathomable goals. When a Dark Angel's force is committed to such a conflict, it invariably remains aloof. Its officers keep their own counsel on matters of tactics and strategy and prefer to maintain their own lines of communication and supply sources. Even when dealing with the battle brothers of other Astartes chapters, the Dark Angels often remain sullenly quiet at the Space Marine Command councils and tactical briefings, though that is not to suggest that they are any less effective on the battlefield. When the Dark Angels do undertake joint operations alongside other chapters, it is quite common for them to do so with others amongst the so-called Unforgiven, the successor chapters of the original Dark Angels Legion. The successors of the First Legion maintain especially close relations, their officers all being members of the Inner Circle. This mysterious body provides a ready-made command network that the Unforgiven chapters can utilize to great effect when coordinating their activities. There is no presumption that the leaders of the Dark Angels have any inherent superiority over those of the other Unforgiven chapters. Rather, the leaders work together closely, and if needed, elect one of their number as nominal commander for the duration of the campaign. In one matter, however, the officers of the Dark Angels have superiority over those of the other Unforgiven chapters through the workings of the Inner Circle, the Hunt for the Fallen. When hunting those turncoat Dark Angels who escaped the fall of Caliban, the Unforgiven operate under the auspices of the highest ranked of the Inner Circle, and the very highest of these is the Supreme Grand Master himself, the Chapter Master of the Dark Angels. Through the machinations of the Unforgiven's Inner Circle, its members are eternally vigilant, never resting in the hunt for the fallen. Even though knowledge of the fallen is withheld from the majority of the brethren, the results of post-battle debriefings and psi-induced stress purges are fed back to the Inner Circle, and any sign of the presence of a fallen analyzed. In addition, the Dark Angels' chaplains are permanently attached to a company, and this allows them to hear the confessions of their brothers and to keep a close watch for signs of the fallen. When such traces are discovered, the Inner Circle moves without hesitation, redeploying Unforgiven forces wherever they happen to be and retasking them with their new target. In most cases, it is the Raven Wing that locates such activity, and the Death Wing that delivers the killing blow, but on occasion, entire Dark Angels strike forces have been recalled from campaigns and committed to engage an enemy that only the highest ranked of its officers have any true knowledge of. While a great deal of the Unforgiven's efforts and resources are committed to the hunt for the fallen, the majority of the brethren have no knowledge of the matter. Rather, the Dark Angels and their successors are constantly warned against the words of the heretic, and their chapter dogma extols the virtues of the eternal hunt for those who would forswear the most powerful of oaths. The company chaplains preach sermons that tell of legendary figures betrayed by their own, often having fought in battles far from home. Numerous such tales exist, and each is revealed as part of a slow, deliberate pattern. The brethren monitored all the while for their reaction. Only upon his ascension to the Inner Circle is a battle brother told anything approaching the truth, and even then, there are some secrets known only at the very highest tiers. How much of the shame of the Dark Angels a battle brother knows depends upon his station within the chapter and how far the agents of the Inner Circle trust him. He may have fought the fallen unwittingly, believing his foe yet another vile traitor worthy only of death. Perhaps his sergeant knew more, certainly his company master did, but he himself almost certainly would not. Conversely, there are some higher-ranked brethren who, despite exemplary service, are never inducted into the Inner Circle. Perhaps the company chaplains harbor some small doubt or have reason to believe the individual would not be able to bear the terrible truth of what occurred during the Horus Heresy. Such Astartes are unlikely to progress much further, for at the highest levels of authority the chapter is ever engaged upon the hunt for the fallen. The Dark Angels were the first of the Emperor's Space Marine legions, and in their earliest incarnation fought as the personal army of the Master of Mankind in the dawning years of the Great Crusade and in the shadowed campaigns that had preceded it. As the prototype of what were to become the Legions Astartes, they served in the final days of the Unification Wars and the early years of the Great Crusade, both as the template for the more specialized legions that were to come after them, and a standard by which these successors would be measured. They were also among the best equipped of Imperial units, making use of large numbers of advanced archaeotech and plasma weapons. In this period, the Dark Angels were not even known as the First Legion, as no others existed yet, for the Emperor simply referred to them as his Angels of Death, or the Six Hosts. These transhuman troops dominated the final days of the Wars of Unification, easily defeating all their Terran opponents and forcing those among the tech priests of Mars who had intervened in the conflict on Terra in the hope of delaying the Emperor's final victory to sue for peace. From this point on, the First Legion ascended in power and the height of the Emperor's favor. But once the most numerous and powerful of the Space Marine legions, the First Legion's numbers would be depleted and its primacy ended by the middle years of the Great Crusade due to solar decades of savage warfare, particularly in the Wars of the Rangdan Xenocides, one of the most apocalyptic campaigns of the Great Crusade. The scars of these battles would change them, as would their reunification with their Primarch Lion Eljonson and the introduction of fresh blood from his adopted homeworld of Caliban, a death world dominated by a warlike, feudal society of techno-barbarians. Caliban's warrior orders provided fertile ground for the Legion's regeneration, and its martial codes and practices were extensively incorporated and adopted by the rebuilding Legion. Stark and uncompromising, the Dark Angels were the first of the Emperor's Space Marine legions, and the truest to the mold from which the Legion's Astartes had been struck. They were killers of the purest and most refined kind, for whom there could be no other destiny but a lifetime of war and death in the name of the Imperium and humanity. They did not build empires, made no attempt to master the ways of peace or the subtle skills of the artist, craftsman, or diplomat. They offered no excuses for their nature and made no compromises in the pursuit of their assigned duty, shirking neither the price they paid in blood nor the price paid in infamy and solitude. Their greatest battles are to be found in no catalogue of imperial compliance or roll of honor. No scholars or poets sing of these glories or remember those fallen in their prosecution, for they were fought against foes so monstrous that it was deemed necessary that all mention of them be erased from history. Such was the nature of their service, not only to be prosecutors of the Great Crusade, but also to serve as the Imperium's most potent bulwark against the unknown terrors that lurked in the dark between the stars. A heraldry of the Dark Angels proclaims their lineage, the first of the Emperor's legions Astartes, but other than that simple fact, little is known of the origins of the Legion and its initial gene stock. The genesis of the Legion's Astartes, as a whole, is a subject shrouded in much secrecy. It is perhaps the greatest and most enduring of the Emperor's many works, and a subject scholars have been warned away from in the latter days of his imperium. What is known with some certainty is that, of all the many breeds of these transhuman warriors, the Dark Angels were conceived by the Emperor as a template and prototype for those that would follow, distilled from the genetic code of the most stable of all his primarchs, and without any attempt to foster specific traits or curb the eccentricities of the stock from which they sprang. Even so, the process by which these first samples were produced was long and laborious, initiated perhaps a standard century or more before the end of the Unification Wars of Terra, and consuming a vast number of test subjects to produce but a handful of stable proto-Astartes. Of these initial creations, referenced in fragmentary records unearthed in the Imperial archives as the primordial strain, almost none are known to have survived initial combat trials and surgical testing. That they form the basis for the initial cultures of the First Legion, and, by merit of the refined process formulated with their creation, the other Space Marine legions as well. This grand experiment exacted a bloody toll upon those territories controlled by the Emperor, for its most critical components were untainted human subjects, all within a specific range of age and physical fitness. Given the state of Terra in the wake of the Wars of Old Night, its surface polluted by the twin scourges of atomic bombardment and genetic phage, such subjects were limited. The initial experiments were conducted with the youth of the Emperor's conquered foes, and those purchased from the nomadic clans of slavers that abounded in the wastes of pre-Unity Terra, and later the toll was borne by flesh tides exacted on those territories brought, willingly or not, into the fold of the Imperium. As such, the Dark Angels did not bear the stamp of any single gene stock, unlike some of the other legions during their earliest years whose character had been molded by the nature of their initial intake. Their first recruits, selected from the best of the stock available to the Emperor, were diverse in origin and shared no single cultural heritage that would shape the way in which they made war. Indeed, the diversity of their origins brought a wealth of disparate martial traditions into the fledgling legion. The dour infantry of the Frankish plains and islands of Albia brought with them the brutal coda that had conquered half the ruined lands of the continent of Europa. The warriors of the far Anatolic steppes of skill at cavalry warfare, the berserkers of frozen Scandia, murderous efficiency, and from a dozen other Terran cultures yet more of the arts of war. The First Legion was the crucible in which all the savage lore of Old Night, all the bitter knowledge and red-handed wisdom accumulated in millennia of war was to be distilled and fashioned into a weapon of rare potency. In those first faltering years of the grand experiment that was the Legion's Astartes, the proto-warriors of the First Legion, barely a few hundred strong, were encouraged to eschew the names of their own people and embrace a new unity unmarked by old loyalties, often taking instead the names of heroes from the old tales that had survived the age of strife. In the first rolls of honor of the Legion can be found Gilgamesh, Heracles, Tarchon, Hengist, and other names imbued by time with the power of legend, combined with the grim aspect granted them by the gene seed of the first Primarch. These warriors quickly gained a reputation among the disparate throng that was at that time the army of the Emperor, for they seemed as a band of gods all cast from a singular and potent mold, fighting at first as small groups within the ranks of the Emperor's host, plying both the skills of their origins and of the drill masters of the Imperial laboratories of the Biotechnical Division. They would come to be known as the Uncrowned Princes, or simply Crowns. This was a homage both to their place in the line of battle and the destiny bestowed upon them by their creator, a title that would inspire both a sense of unity and a certain arrogance in the first Space Marines and spur them to lead the way amongst the growing brotherhood of the Legions Astartes. This, in the Legion's earliest moments, was the genesis of the hosts of the First Legion, which would later be refined by their Primarch, Lion Eljonson, into the hexagrammaton wings of his Dark Angels, a myriad of informal groups within the early companies of the Legion that worked to adapt the doctrines of battle brought from those disparate origins and create a coda of battle fit for the transhuman armies of the Emperor. The hosts were not bound by company or commander and existed throughout the Legion. At any given battle or engagement, at least some small number of a given host would be present to advise and lead should their expertise be required. In the early years of the First Legion's existence, there were many more hosts than would later exist under the hexagrammaton organization, with as many as 18 such formations noted by their distinct heraldry in the earliest records of the Unification Wars where the Astartes appear. The Third Siege of Antioch in 603. M30 saw the participation of 9 distinct hosts across 4 separate companies of the Legion, though at this point they numbered less than 30 warriors each and displayed significant tactical overlap in the methods they employed to breach the walls of that ancient enclave. Time would see the many hosts of those chaotic years quickly resolved into a smaller number of more focused hosts. But in those early years, with their brother legions still but handfuls of warriors newly cast from a rough mold, the First Legion became the testbed for the various tactics and doctrines that would later become the Principia Bellicosa. As the other legions grew to a size large enough to engage in small-scale combat, some of the more specialized hosts became obsolete, unnecessary in the face of warriors more adept at that style of warfare, while others were made extinct by the inadequacies of their methods and the brutal nature of war in the 30th millennium. Far from harming the Legion, this process of bloody evolution left it strong, a weapon well honed by the fighting on terror. It also forged a bond between the disparate warriors who made up that early Legion, a bond based upon the sense of superiority and distinction instilled in them by the servants of the Emperor that trained them and the awe they inspired in those they fought beside. As with much knowledge regarding the First Legion and its master, there was a vast body of rumor and little fact regarding the earliest years of the Primarch Lion Eljonson. Before the start of the Great Crusade, the gestation pod containing the infant Primarch that had been mysteriously teleported through the warp from the Emperor's subterranean gene laboratory beneath the Himalaysian mountains landed on the feudal death world of Caliban in what would become the Segmentum Obscurus. Caliban was a planet whose surface was largely covered by immense forests, inhabited by terrible, monstrous beasts mutated by the touch of chaos in the centuries after the birth of the chaos god Slaanesh due to the planet's proximity to the nearby Eye of Terror. Johnson managed to survive in the forests alone, living as a wild man far from civilization. Caliban was home to many knightly orders of warrior aristocrats created to defend its people, and the massive fortress monasteries they lived within to defend themselves from the great beasts. These knights maintained a few aspects of Caliban's ancient technology from before the Age of Strife, and wielded primitive bolt pistols, and wore suits of simple power armor that were handed down from knight to knight. Despite these technological trappings, however, Caliban remained very much a pre-industrial society whose warriors rode to war on horseback. One of the most prominent knightly organizations was known simply as the Order and was made up of commoners and nobles alike, whereas the other knightly orders were drawn by tradition only from the Calibanite nobility. Over 150 Terran years later, the young lion would be discovered by a hunting party of the Knights of the Order in the depths of Caliban's forests. Within these forests dwelt a breed of creature now unknown in the galaxy, monstrous chimeric weapons left over from the Age of Strife, driven by a hunger that could not be slaked and fully capable of rendering an armored warrior into a ruin of blood and flesh in seconds. How long the young Primarch had survived alone in the green deeps cannot be known for certain, for the lion himself seldom spoke of those times. The knights that found him assumed from his stature and bearing that he could not have spent more than a solar decade alone. that the growth and development of the Primarchs does not follow the pattern of mortal humans, and they do not age as do those untouched by the Emperor's genius. The span of standard years in which the lion prowled Caliban's sea of trees may well have been far longer than can be easily comprehended. Indeed, the legends of those fortified towns that bordered the stretch of forest where the Primarch was discovered spoke of a forest spirit that haunted the depths, a spirit of small stature, but whose form was that of a man who was known only by the mysterious marks he left in his wake and had existed for nearly a standard century before the discovery of eljonson. Regardless of whether the lion had stalked the world forest of Caliban for a Terran decade or a century, that time had left its mark upon him. The lightless depths beneath the forest canopy teemed with horrors, rapacious killers that often emerged from the deeps to hunt among the towns and villages of Caliban's slowly dwindling human population. There, amongst the most foul monstrosities imaginable, the lion spent his childhood. He learned to keep silent, lest he grant advantage to those that stalked him. He learned to fight only when he could win, lest he be wounded too gravely to survive. And he learned that once battle was joined it could end only in death, that the strong would survive and the weak would fall. He fought for his life with nothing but his bare hands and a determination so inhumanly strong that it served him better than any iron-forged blade. The lion was no feral berserker, but rather a calculating hunter ruled by logic and not simple rage. When he was discovered at last by the Knights of Caliban, he was judged so dangerous that it might be best to have him slain. Treated as one of the great beasts of the forest, so akin to them was he. It was the judgment of one man that would see him brought into the realm of mankind and away from that of beasts, and that man was named Luther. As a champion among the warriors that had defended Caliban through the long years of Old Night, Luther named his new charge lion eljonson, which meant the lion, son of the forest in the Calibanite dialect of Low Gothic, and raised him as a knight of the order. Luther taught eljonson the laws and strictures of the order, to mete out justice, as a man rather than as a beast, and gave him something that the young Primarch had never before had, a reason to fight beyond simple survival. Caliban was a dying world, its people besieged by the great beasts that thronged in the hidden depths of the forest, and slowly driven to extinction. The order, which built and manned the great fortresses at the borders of the wild, had vainly tried to stem the tide but had succeeded only at slowing the pace of their people's destruction, for they were too few to do more than defend their fastnesses from the constant assaults. Eljonson was taken to the Order's chief fortress monastery of Aljaruk and taught human ways. The lion learned to speak incredibly quickly, and soon mastered all of the necessary aspects of Calibanite culture faster than anyone, including Luther, his mentor, foster father, and best friend, believed possible. Before long, eljonson had become a fierce warrior in the Order's ranks, though of his years living alone in Caliban's forests, he said nothing. Then or later, with Luther at his side, eljonson ultimately rose into the highest ranks of the Order. At the height of his reputation, eljonson made clear his extraordinary ambition. He called for a grand crusade to exterminate the great beasts of Caliban so that the people of his world could finally know peace and live free from fear. This was received with great enthusiasm by the other members of the Order, and even the other knightly orders, but it proved to be a time-consuming process that took nearly a solar decade of constant warfare against the terrible dangers of the deep forests. Eljonson would quickly prove not only a superlative warrior and strategist, but also a leader whose quiet confidence and iron will drew recruits to the Order in numbers never before seen. With each victory against the great beasts of the forest, each fell head planted upon the walls of the Order's fortresses, more warriors took up arms with hope in more than simple survival. Lion eljonson stood at the forefront of this new crusade, not by choice, for he had ever been taciturn and prone to seek solitude, but by action, always to be found at the fore of any battle, and unafraid to speak his mind or act when others might hesitate. By his order the old traditions that allowed only the nobility to fight among the knightly orders of Caliban were dropped, swelling the Order's ranks further at the cost of some dissent within the ranks of the more traditional knights. Any Calibanite knightly order that did not follow eljonson's lead, such as the Knights of Lupus of the Northern Forests, which feared like many that the destruction of the great beasts would upend Caliban's traditional social order, was destroyed to the last man. Within the space of a solar decade, the Order's ranks had grown to the point that they were able to take the war for their survival ever deeper into the world forest itself. With Lion eljonson and Luther at their head, they unleashed their crusade to rid Caliban of its curse, bringing flame and steel to the lair of the monsters that had hunted them for generations beyond count. The war was long and bloody, with hundreds slain for each monstrous nest put to the torch, and many grew weary of the slaughter. All save the grim knight, eljonson. The lion knew that mercy had no place in war, to leave with their task unfinished, and with any of the foe yet alive would be to waste all of the lives spent in its pursuit. There could be only one end, and that was the total annihilation of the enemy by whatever means was needed. Eljonson set the knights to ambush the great beasts as they came to feed, poison the pools at which the creatures drank, and set ablaze vast tracts of the forest to set them to flight. He gave the foe no respite, and hunted them till no more could be found. And when his warriors spoke of his prowess and victories, it was fear that colored their words as much as awe. Some of Caliban's aristocracy, following in the wake of the Knights of Lupus, feared his new methods and determination enough to declare open rebellion, some fearing the changes he had wrought upon the tradition-bound people of Caliban, and others simply seeking to claim the power Lion eljonson had come to wield. These traitors to the cause of Caliban's salvation were put down without mercy, the ranks of their knights and soldiers culled in their entirety, and their fastnesses torn down as a warning to others. At the end of the crusade against the great beasts, with both the lion and Luther exhausted by the terrible cost the fighting had exacted, it was eljonson that received the battle honors and the title of Grand Master of the Order. He accepted the accolade without fanfare, for such human eccentricities still seemed less worthwhile to the youth that had grown to manhood among monsters. He understood little the value some placed upon titles and rewards, for his grim and solitary habits had always kept him distant from others, and he saw not the change his rise had wrought in Luther. For where they had once competed as equals for honor and victory, the Primarch had now eclipsed his mentor and brother, leaving him behind, as he grudgingly accepted the people's adulation and offer to rule over all of Caliban. It was a wound dealt in ignorance, for eljonson did not see the spark of fierce pride that burned within his brother ignite to jealousy in the face of his triumphs, a wound that would fester in the years to follow. Had the Emperor not arrived shortly after this victory, descending from the heavens to claim his lost son, then perhaps this wound might have healed in Caliban's new peace, but this was not to be. The Emperor came to heap new glories upon the Lion, granting him command of the Legion, whom he renamed the Dark Angels after an ancient Calibanite myth that spoke to their grim mien, and making him a general within the vast imperial army that sought to conquer the galaxy. Lion eljonson would soon leave for distant Terra and his new destiny, bringing his uncompromising and remorseless style of warfare to the ranks of the imperial forces. To him would fall the role of watchman at the edge of the Emperor's domain, the bane of monsters and beasts, and the bearer of weapons too terrible to entrust to any other. He would be the cold and inevitable destroyer, the doom that once unleashed could not be recalled, subverted or delayed, taught by the black depths of the forest of Caliban the value of cold, ruthless tenacity. Lion eljonson was the first of all the Primarchs, war distilled into its rawest and most fundamental essence, death that walked like a man, and the galaxy would be forever changed by his return.